Water is a kind of testimony. A man can travel the desert for weeks and never understand it, not truly, until he learns to read what moves beneath. The kind of men who find water are not the ones who need it most. They are the ones most willing to dig, to feel the ground, to know somehow, without knowing how they know, that somewhere down there in the dark and pressure and stone, moisture collects. Patience and faith and the calloused hands of a man who has learned that the difference between dead ground and living ground is often only 6 feet of depth. This is the story of Gideon Colter. Gideon Colter had spent 43 years becoming a man who knew things others did not. He was a water finder, a well digger, the kind of man who rode into a settlement and could stand in the middle of a field and point to a place and say, "Dig here." Sometimes he was right. Enough of the time that settlements paid him in silver and gratitude, and he took the silver and left the gratitude behind like something not worth carrying. He was lean from the sun, weathered in the particular way a man becomes weathered when his work is under the open sky, with nothing between him and the light except a wide-brimmed hat and his own stubbornness. His face was the color of aged leather, creased at the corners of his eyes from 43 years of squinting into distance. He had blue eyes, sharp and bright as broken glass, the kind of eyes that made people think he could see things that were not visible. He was clean-shaven, and the razor came out every Sunday morning, though there was no one in the world to see him do it. His teeth were still mostly his own. His hands were the hands of his work, scarred, burned dark from sun and rope, with calluses thick enough to spark flint. He wore a sweat-stained tan wide-brimmed hat, a faded white cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, brown canvas trousers that had been expensive once, worn leather boots, and always around his neck a canteen. His digging tool was a short-handled shovel, more pick than shovel, the kind of tool a man carries when space is limited and precision matters more than speed. The men who know water are rare, and the men who are willing to use their knowledge to break the law of their own community are rarer still. Gideon had never thought of himself as someone who would do such a thing. He lived quietly. He took his work. He asked no questions about the politics of the places he passed through. But a man does not discover what he is made of until the moment arrives that requires him to discover it. The moment that tells him whether he is the kind of man who watches or the kind of man who acts. Gideon Colter was about to discover which kind he was. In the summer of 1884, Gideon Colter was riding south from San Pedro Valley toward Tucson, toward a settlement called Mesquite Flat that had sent word they needed water. The season had been dry, not unusual for Arizona territory in August, when the heat made even the tough grasses curl and the cattle moved only at dusk and dawn. But this summer was meaner than most. The thermometer at the trading post had read 112 degrees at 2 in the afternoon, and the sun was nowhere close to setting. Gideon had learned long ago not to fight the heat. He traveled early and late, and in the killing hours of midday, he sat under a mesquite tree or in a rock overhang and waited for the world to become habitable again. The desert in summer is not a place of beauty. It is a place of negotiation. The negotiation between a man and the fact that he is not meant to be here, that he survives by courtesy of small shadows and the water in his canteen. He came into Mesquite Flat in the late afternoon when the heat was starting, almost imperceptibly, to ease. The settlement was 12 buildings arranged in a rough square around a central open space. The dust was ankle deep. the kind of dust that gets into everything and becomes part of everything and never entirely leaves. A few horses were tied outside the trading post. A Mexican woman was sweeping a porch with what looked like her last reserve of energy. A man in a leather vest was standing in the doorway of what passed for a saloon, his hand not quite on his pistol, but positioned where his hand could reach it without appearing to position it. Gideon did not like the feel of the settlement. He dismounted from his horse, a dark bay mare named Smoke, and looped her reins over the hitching rail. He was walking toward the trading post when he heard the sound. It was not loud. The desert has its own way of swallowing noise. But it was the sound of a crowd, not a happy crowd. The kind of sound a settlement makes when something is about to happen that everyone knows is going to happen, and they are gathering to watch it happen because watching is easier than stopping it. He followed the sound. Around the back of the trading post, past a corral where maybe a dozen cattle stood in the shadeless heat, to the western edge of the settlement where a large cottonwood tree stood alone in the desert. The only tree of any size for miles. The tree was old. It had been there longer than the settlement. It was the kind of tree a man could hang something from, and that was exactly what the people had gathered to do. There were maybe 30 men assembled. Some wore the clothes of ranchers. Some wore the clothes of settlers who had failed at ranching and taken whatever work they could find. A few wore the insignia of being men with money. They were arranged in a half circle around the tree, and in the center of that half circle, tied to the tree with his hands bound behind his back, was a young Apache warrior. The warrior was 19 or 20, with the lean, muscled build of a man who had never had enough to eat and had used that hunger to sharpen himself. His skin was the color of old copper. His hair was long and black, tied back with a leather cord, and a single eagle feather was braided into it. He was shirtless, and there was a knife wound on his left shoulder that looked maybe 3 days old and infected. His wrists were wrapped with rope burns from the binding. He wore deerskin leggings and nothing else. He was not afraid. That was the thing that stood out to Gideon in the moment his eyes landed on the warrior. Fear would have been rational. The warrior was not afraid. He was angry. The kind of anger that comes from understanding that the people around you are not going to listen to anything you have to say because they have already decided who you are and what you did. A man stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall, maybe 50, with a weathered face that had been hard for so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. He wore a silver belt buckle and rode a horse that cost money, the kind of man who had claimed the best land and kept it because he had the rifles to keep it. His name was Creed. The crowd parted slightly when he walked, the way water parts when something heavy moves through it. Creed was holding a rope. The rope had a noose on the end of it. He was positioning the noose over the branch of the cottonwood tree. No one was stopping him. The local marshal was standing to the side, his face carefully arranged into an expression of neutrality that was very close to consent. "This Apache came down from the ridge 3 days ago," Creed said. His voice was the voice of a man used to being listened to. "He was found near the Morrison barn at dawn. The barn had been burning. The Morrisons are ranchers like myself, good people. They lost everything. The grain, the tools, the horses in the corral, everything." Creed gestured toward the warrior. "We found him a mile from the barn, moving south. He has got a blade wound, and he has got dried blood on his hands." The crowd murmured. The sound of consensus. The sound of men who had already decided and were pleased to hear someone else say it out loud. Gideon walked forward. He did not plan to walk forward. His body simply started walking, and his mind caught up to it a second later, confused at what his feet were doing. He came to stand between the crowd and the warrior. The crowd did not know who he was. They saw a sunburned man in a sweat-stained hat. They saw a stranger. They did not stop him from walking up to the warrior and looking at the knife wound on the warrior's shoulder. The wound was bad. It was infected, the skin around it red and hot. The boy, for Gideon could see now that it was a boy, not a man, though the warrior's eyes held enough anger and pain for a man of 60, the boy had been bleeding. When you bleed that much, you do not have the strength to ride a horse and set a fire. Lightning started that fire, Gideon said. No one responded. He had interrupted the script they were following. Creed looked at him. You were there. No, Gideon said. But lightning in August in the desert looks like something set by a man because it is so rare. And because it happens fast and spreads fast and stops where it stops based on what fuel is available, not based on some Indian's hatred of one particular white man's barn. If this boy set that fire, he would have stayed to watch. Raiders want to see the result. This boy has been riding for 3 days with that wound. He is running, not celebrating. The warrior's eyes moved to Gideon's face. For a moment, just a moment, the anger softened into something else. Surprise, maybe, or hope. The kind of hope that is immediately crushed because hope is dangerous, and believing in hope kills you faster than disbelief. Creed took a step forward. You got some reason to defend this Apache? I got eyes, Gideon said. That is all the reason I need. He reached down and pulled his short-handled shovel from his belt. He held it up so everyone could see it. It was a tool, nothing more. But a tool in the hand of a man with a purpose becomes something else. He turned and swung the shovel at the rope that was around the warrior's wrists. The rope snapped. The warrior did not move. Even when freed, the warrior stood still, as though remaining motionless was part of the strategy. Creed pulled his pistol. So did 4 other men. They drew so fast and so casual that it was clear they had done it many times and would do it many times again. They did not point the pistols at Gideon yet, but the pistols were out and they were ready, and the intention was clear. Get away from him, Creed said. Gideon grabbed the warrior's arm. Run, the warrior ran. Gideon did not run. He stood between the warrior and the crowd, with his shovel held across his body, and he watched Creed watch the warrior's back as the Apache disappeared around a building. Creed could have shot. Creed could have shot the warrior in the back. But the warrior was already gone, already out of sight, already in the desert where a man on foot had maybe a 1 in 50 chance of survival if he did not know where the water was. And Creed knew that. Creed lowered his pistol. You just made a choice, Creed said. I did, Gideon said. You will not work another day in this territory. Maybe, Gideon said. He turned and walked away. Behind him, the crowd did not follow. The crowd was silent. The kind of silence that happens when men have watched someone make a choice they would not have made themselves. The marshal, standing to the side, still had his expression of careful neutrality. Some men maintain neutrality because they do not want to take a side. Some men maintain neutrality because they are afraid of what will happen if they do. The marshal was the second kind. Gideon made his way through the settlement. The Mexican woman had stopped sweeping. She was watching him. The man in the leather vest had stepped fully into the doorway. No one tried to stop him. He untied Smoke from the hitching rail and mounted her. Then he rode out of Mesquite Flat, away from the settlement, away from the crowd, away from Creed and the cottonwood tree, and the rope that had been ready for a hanging. He rode southeast toward the high desert where the ridges were red and the air was cleaner. Behind him, he could hear hoofbeats, not pursuing, not yet, but coming. He pushed Smoke to a pace that the heat did not recommend, but that the situation required. The desert was an oven. The sky was white with heat, the sun a presence so overwhelming that it was almost a sound. The ground beneath Smoke's hooves was packed dust and rock that had been baking for weeks without rain. But he could see the warrior's tracks, fresh, desperate, a man running on foot toward nowhere. Gideon found him 2 miles out, collapsed in a sandy wash. The warrior was conscious, but barely. His breathing was shallow. The shoulder wound was worse now, moving, running, bleeding. Gideon lifted him, not gently, but efficiently, and got him onto Smoke's back. The warrior made a sound, not a word, not in English, something in Apache, something that might have been pain, or might have been gratitude, or might have been the sound a man makes when he is trying not to die. They rode deeper into the desert. Gideon knew where the rock overhangs were, the places where the heat accumulated and stored, but where a man could find shade from the worst of the midday sun. He found one that faced north, deep enough that the shadow extended a good 50 feet into the rock. He laid the warrior down in that shadow and started a fire, because fire is the only thing that tells the Apache that this place is not a trap. And he knew that. He knew the warrior had seen white men use fire and shadow as ambush tactics. Fire meant someone was not hiding. Fire meant this was not a trick. He had water, not much, maybe 3/4 of a canteen. In the desert, in August, 3/4 of a canteen is the difference between having a tomorrow and not having a tomorrow. He poured water onto cloth and used the cloth to cool the shoulder wound. He poured water into the warrior's mouth, a little at a time. The warrior drank, but his eyes stayed on Gideon, measuring, not trusting, but allowing the possibility of trust, which is sometimes all a man can do in a moment of extreme vulnerability. "What is your name?" Gideon asked. The warrior said something in Apache. "English," Gideon said. "Natas," the warrior said, means the one who runs. "You are running right now," Gideon said. "So the name is working." The warrior made a sound. It might have been a laugh. They waited. The heat passed its peak in the early afternoon, and then the heat started, just barely, to ease. By evening, the temperature had dropped to maybe 98 degrees, which felt cool in the way that a winter coat feels light. Gideon shared his water. It was a strange thing to do, to share water with a man your community considered an enemy. But Gideon had learned that community is a flexible thing. He came from a community of water digging, of heat, of terrain, of the kind of knowledge that lives in a man's hands and bones. That community did not care much about the politics of settlement and tribe. They stayed in the rock shelter. Gideon could see Creed's men riding past at a distance, searching the desert in a wide arc. They did not find the shelter. The shelter was old, was not meant to be obvious, was not the kind of place a man thinks to look unless he knows the desert very well. And Creed's men did not know the desert. They knew the settlements and the territory claimed by ranches. They did not know the empty space. That night, the stars came out. This far from any settlement, the stars were overwhelming. They filled the sky from horizon to horizon, so thick that they looked like spilled flour, like the universe was leaking its light out into the world, and could not be bothered to gather it back. Gideon and the warrior sat outside the shelter, and Natas looked up at the stars and spoke in Apache, speaking to the stars, or to whoever listens to men in the desert, or just speaking because the silence was too much. Gideon understood nothing of the words, but he understood the thing that was happening. A man coming to terms with the fact that his community was gone, that the only place left for him was the darkness and the stars, and a stranger with a shovel. "Why?" Natas said. "You save me, not your fight." "A man came with rope," Gideon said. "I saw a man come with rope to hang someone. I cut the rope, that is all." "They will come," Natas said. "Your people." "Probably," Gideon said, "but they will not find us tonight. Tomorrow is a different problem." They slept. The desert at night is cold, the kind of cold that seems impossible given the heat that preceded it. But the ground loses its heat the moment the sun is gone, and the sky becomes something else, vast, cold, unforgiving. Gideon shared his blanket with the warrior, not out of sentiment, but out of practicality. A man with a fever cannot regulate his own heat. Gideon could provide warmth. In the desert, warmth is survival. By morning, Natas's fever had broken, not because of anything Gideon did, but because the boy's body was young and strong and refusing to die. By morning, Gideon realized that everything in his life had changed. There was a world in which he had cut a rope to hang a man and then ridden away. There was this world in which he was responsible for keeping the boy alive. He had had a life before yesterday. He would not have that life anymore. The settlements would not hire a man who freed an Apache. Creed would make sure of that. Creed had money and land, and the kind of authority that comes from having been the first to claim something. Gideon had his hands and his knowledge, and the ability to find water in places where other men could not find it. But if no one would hire him to find water, his hands and his knowledge would not matter. He had always assumed his career was the thing that mattered, his reputation. The trust that settlements placed in him to find water where no water was supposed to be. He had built that over decades, and he had destroyed it in a moment with a shovel and a choice he had not thought about before making it. He sat in the darkness of the rock shelter, with the coals of the fire glowing red and the wounded boy sleeping the sleep of fever and exhaustion. And he understood that he had bought a moral victory at the cost of everything he had built. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his whole life finding water for people who would not appreciate it. He had spent his whole life being useful in the way that utility is appreciated only when it is needed, then forgotten the moment the need is satisfied. And now, in the moment, he had finally done something that actually mattered, something that actually required him to stand against the weight of his entire community. He had made himself unemployable. This is the thing no one tells you about standing up for what is right, that it costs in material ways that continue long after the moment of defiance. That in a world where most people are too afraid or too invested in the existing system to make real choices, the person who makes a real choice often finds themselves alone, not celebrated, not lifted up by their community. Alone. He told Natas this when the boy woke, not as complaint, but as fact. The way a man states facts when stating facts is the clearest way to think through what comes next. He spoke about the settlements, about creed, about the way a man becomes unmarketable once he has crossed the people with power. Natas listened. His fever had broken in the night, and with it had come clarity. His eyes were steady now. My father watches, Natas said. My tribe. We have been watching you. Why would your tribe be watching me? Gideon said. We watch all men in the desert, Natas said. We watch the ones who understand the ground. My father says, a man who finds water is a man who understands the earth. Such a man is either friend or enemy, but he cannot be invisible. Natas paused. I did not come to Mesquite Flat by accident. I was sent to watch the settlement, and I was there when the barn burned. It was lightning, but the ranchers needed someone to blame. They needed the fire to be about what they could punish. My father has been watching you since you first came to this territory. He watched you find water in places where others said no water existed. He watched you understand the desert the way we understand the desert. And he said to me, if you encounter this man, and if he is the kind of man we think he is, then watch him, because the kind of man who finds water might understand that water flows both ways. Natas said something else then, and the words sounded like an invitation. I bring you to my people, Natas said. You saved me. Now my people save you. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. They rode south and east, deeper into the Arizona territory, toward the high desert, where the ridges were red rock, and the landscape became less and less a place where white men had claimed anything, and more a place that belonged entirely to itself. The terrain changed. The saguaro cacti gave way to different vegetation. The ground became rockier, more complex. Gideon felt the change in the land beneath him. He had been reading the ground his whole life, and this ground was telling him something. There was water here. He could feel it, not on the surface, but beneath. Water that had collected in the rock, in the stone, in the ways that only a man who understood pressure and depth could find it. They rode for 4 days. On the afternoon of the 4th day, they came to a ridge that overlooked a vast expanse of red rock and dust. And spread across that expanse, at a distance that made them look small, but which was actually not small at all, maybe 100 Apache warriors on horseback, painted for something, arranged in a formation that spoke of discipline and authority. Natas made a sound. It was the sound of a man coming home. They rode down the ridge. The warriors watched them come. At the center of the formation was an older man, maybe 60, with the bearing of someone who had commanded men for many years. His horse was a pinto, and the horse stood still while all the other horses shifted and moved. The old man was Natas's father. Gideon did not need to be told this. The resemblance was in the way they held themselves, in the way the old man looked at Natas and saw not his son, but the person his son had become. The old man rode forward. Gideon did not move. He sat on smoke with his hands visible, and he waited. This was a moment where his actions could be misinterpreted as threat or as respect, and he had learned not to move much during moments like this. The old man came close. He looked at Gideon's hands first, at the scars, at the calluses, at the evidence of labor. Then he looked at the shovel on Gideon's belt. Then he looked at Gideon's face. And then he spoke through Natas, who served as translator. You dig for water, the old man said. It was not a question. Gideon nodded. We will show you where the water lives, the old man said. In this land, there is an old water. It comes from deep. We have known it for centuries, but the way to reach it, we have lost. The old ones who knew where to dig have passed into the shadow. You dig. You have the knowledge. You find this water, you bring it up. You make the settlement prosper. This is the debt. This is how we repay the man who saved Natas. They rode north, not back to Mesquite Flat, but to a place near it, on Gideon's own land. The old man and 4 warriors rode with them, and they showed Gideon a particular spot in the desert. Just a spot, no visible difference from any other spot. But Gideon knelt and felt the ground. He closed his eyes and felt the pressure of the stone, and he felt the water. An aquifer, not a small one, not a well that would serve 30 people for a season. A massive source of water that would sustain hundreds of people for years. He started digging. It took him 7 days of labor, moving stone and soil, going down and down, using every technique he had learned in 43 years of finding water. The old man watched. He did not help, but he watched, and there was respect in the watching. On the 8th day, water started to flow. Not a trickle, a flow, a source. The warriors who had ridden with the old man stood in silence. Then they sang something. Gideon did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was a song of gratitude, a song of alliance, a song of a debt being repaid. The old man handed Gideon something. It was a digging tool, short-handled like his own shovel, but inlaid with turquoise. The kind of tool that was made for a man, not by a man, but by the hands of someone who knew what they were making. A man who gives water deserves to find it, the old man said. You will carry this. This will be the symbol. When people see this tool, they will know. This man is a friend. This man is not an enemy. This man is a maker of life. Word of the water reached the settlements. It reached Mesquite Flat. It reached Creed. And something shifted. The rage of a man losing a vendetta is powerful, but the relief of a man who has been carrying the worry of drought is more powerful. The cattle could drink. The people could drink. The settlement could expand beyond the brittle, fragile existence it had been living on the edge of no water. Creed's cattle drank from Gideon's well, and Creed, riding out to check on his herd and finding them healthy for the first time in months, found his rage had no fuel to burn on. Gideon was a different man now. The settlement still hired him. The water was too valuable to care about politics. But the hiring was different. There was respect in it. There was the kind of respect that comes from understanding that a man has done something that seemed impossible and done it anyway. In the summers, when the heat was at its worst, smoke would appear on the ridge to the south. Gideon would fill a barrel with water from his well, and he would leave it at the edge of his property in the shade, and by morning it would be gone. Always empty by morning. Natas came sometimes. The old man came once, and they sat in the desert and shared water, and did not speak much, because sometimes words are the wrong shape for what 2 people have agreed to understand about each other. Years passed. The well did not run dry. The turquoise tool hung in Gideon's cabin above the fireplace, and the light from the fire would catch the stone and send little pieces of blue light into the darkness. A man's life is often measured by the moments in which he decides who he actually is when the moment arrives. Gideon Colter had decided, on an afternoon in August in the desert, that he was the kind of man who cuts rope, that he was the kind of man who listens to what the ground tells him, that he was the kind of man who understands that water flows both ways, that finding it for others is also finding it for himself. The desert never forgot him. The desert remembered, and the memory became a story. And the story became the kind of story that gets passed down and passed down again until no one living knows if it actually happened or if it is the kind of truth that is more important than facts. If this story stayed with you, Leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.